welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is John Wood. Randy Isaac, our regular host, is away this week, but he will return in March for our monthly series of Zoom discussions that are focused on an article, book review published in the ASA Journal Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. We're so glad you're here today for this conversation. Today, our guests are authors of a book. I'm going to hold this up so you can actually see it. As you see, this is about modifying our genes, important CRISPR technology. And this project and this book is a product of a Faraday Institute project called Human Genome Modifications and Human Dignity. And it explored the Nobel Prize-winning development, now Nobel Prize-winning development of CRISPR-Cas9 techniques. If you haven't read about CRISPR technology, there's a very interesting biography of Walter Isaacson's The Codebreaker about Jennifer Doudna and gene editing, the future of the human race. That's a great place to get a context, and especially if you want to talk to your pastors or your friends about this kind of technology. I've found that his writing really helpful in just kind of thinking it through. We live in a remarkable time. These last 3 decades have witnessed, first of all, the sequencing of our own human genome. That was co-led by our own ASA fellow Francis Collins, head of NIH. And now we've got this breakthrough technology that shows great promise and great risk. I grew up, as many of you did, in the age of GMOs, and we were doing kind of shotgun techniques, very crude sort of ways of modifying organisms. And now we're in a very different position. We live in a time when the aphorism, "we shape our tools, and then they shape us," has greater force than either Henry David Thoreau, who I think first said that, or Marshall McLuhan could have even imagined. This is a remarkable time. So we're pleased today to have Alexander Massmann, Alex, and Keith Fox with us from across the pond, gentlemen. It's 7 in the evening where you are. We're glad to have you here. And their book, Human Genome Modification and Human Dignity, it explores this amazing technique. So I want to start just briefly by asking each of you. We'll start, Alex, with you. If you just tell us a little bit about your background, where you got your education, and where you're at currently. Could you tell us that?
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to discuss this fascinating topic tonight. Thank you, John, also for the introductory words. So I have been thinking about and reading and writing about CRISPR for, well, almost 8 years now. I'm a theologian myself, so I'm not a scientist. I'm from Germany. I got my degree at Heidelberg University, writing and studying in the area of 20th century theology and ethics. I may perhaps add, in a Christian group, I first came to faith, maybe not with one particular event, but growing up in a parsonage. My father was a pastor. That sort of was the element into which eventually I grew. And faith typically comes in fits and starts, I suppose. But eventually it also dawned on me that it's a very good way to experience life and think about life in a larger framework. So that was part of my motivation to study theology. And then doing more on theology and ethics in the 20th century, I also discovered that theology and the natural sciences are a really fascinating area. That's how the connection with the Faraday Institute came about. So I moved there in order to be a postdoc. Now I'm here in Cambridge teaching in theology, writing and publishing, and I'm also publishing a regular column in a website run by German Protestant churches, where this used to be a weekly column where I reflected on topical
Mm-hmm.
issues from an ethical perspective. We've scaled it down a little bit. Now we're at a monthly rhythm.
All
But
right.
so that fits well. It's also this ethical area.
Very good. Thank you, Alex. This is quintessential ASA, bringing science and theology together, and you embody that. So that's really powerful. Keith, I want to turn to you. If you could tell us about your background a little, in particular your academic background, and you're you're an emeritus professor. Our hair changes in some ways that we can't control, but as we age.
Yes, thank you, John, for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be with everybody this evening. Thank you for having me with you. My background is that I was brought up in a Christian family and taken to church. And in my teenage years, as many teenagers, I first got bored with Christianity, and then through a variety of things, my Christian faith came alive, and I understood the things that I'd been brought up with. And for me, that happened at exactly the same time as my fascination with science started.
Mm-hmm.
So my Christian faith has grown in parallel with my scientific understanding. And for me, there's never been any real fundamental contradiction between those two. I went to Cambridge. I did natural sciences my degree, specializing in biochemistry, and then stayed there to do a PhD actually in pharmacology. Stayed a few more years as a postdoctoral worker, and then moved to Southampton University in 1987. And worked my way up through becoming professor of biochemistry. I retired from that just over a year ago now. So I have an emeritus position. I still keep in touch with the department I was in. And at various stages along the way, I was chairman of Christians in Science, which is the UK equivalent of the ASA,
Right.
As well as being associate director and then director of the Faraday Institute in Cambridge. And it's been a real privilege to be able to combine those two professions of faith and science.
That's great. Thanks, Keith. And in particular, as a way into this conversation, I was reading your biographical information, which shows up as we can all search the web quickly. And I noticed in your research that, could you tell us just very briefly, for an ecologist like myself, what kind of biochemical research you were doing on DNA and these small molecules that connect with DNA in
Yes,
tell
thank
us
you.
just briefly about
Yeah, so my research is largely concerned with DNA. A large part of it is physical chemistry. I'm fascinated by it. It is the most amazing molecule in the universe, without any doubt at all.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of things have to interact with it. Proteins are switching genes on and off at various times. Small molecules that are often used as chemotherapeutic agents are interacting with DNA. And a lot of my research has been trying to get to understand how these things can interact with the DNA, and in some cases find a particular sequence amongst the 3 billion letters of the human genome and home in on a particular part. In the latter years of my research, I got interested in some rather unusual DNA structures. Everybody thinks of DNA being a double helix. Under some circumstances, it can form 3-stranded or even 4-stranded structures that are involved in some means of control. And I got fascinated with those as well.
Right. And I understand that you and your colleague developed a kind of high throughput fluorescence assay to detect those kind of molecules and that
Yes, for
process.
assessing the ways in which molecules can bind to DNA and stabilize
Okay.
it and interact with it, we developed what now would probably be called low throughput, but in those days it was certainly very high throughput compared to the
Right.
technology at the
Okay.
time.
Sure. Well, that's fascinating because what you two gentlemen bring together here is so essential for today. As you've been talking, I'm thinking about things like DNA as a molecule being used in computing. And you think, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so when you talk about physical chemistry and DNA and how it can be utilized in other ways, so it appears to me, and I'm sure to many of us, that the implications of the kinds of things that you're talking about here are really expansive. I mean, it feels like there's a sort of new era opening up for us in a way. And perhaps you could say a little bit about that in terms of context, maybe talk about how you got interested in this project and what it means. And then we'll go to some specific questions. Um, Keith, you want to start with that?
Yes, I mean, in DNA, it has so many potential usage. In nanoscience, it can make all kinds of structures that can be used for delivery, that can be used for computing. Excuse me. Obviously, what we're interested in this project is its use in biology and the way in which we can alter, excuse me, the DNA of various organisms, and the way in which that technology has very rapidly emerged since the Nobel Prize winners developed this in about 2013, 2014. In the few years since, the technology has rapidly advanced.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Alex, maybe you could say something to us about theologically. Why is this such an important conversation for us today? What do you think?
Well, for me, one of the interesting issues in the theology of creation would be how human creativity interrelates with divine creativity. So it would obviously be wrong just to put those at odds with each other. This was one of the ways in which I started to develop an interest in the relationship between theology and science. So, say in the creation account in Genesis 1, it's not simply that all of the creatures suddenly emerge just directly in response to the divine creative word, but we're also reading the divine command, let the earth bring forth plants, etc. So creatures are given a power to be creative themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that power is really what makes this such an explosive issue. Human power over creation. I think,
Mm-hmm.
John, you said before, these kinds of activities can be a force for good, or they can be questionable as well. So CRISPR and our increasing knowledge about DNA really exemplifies this tremendous power that humans have. And then, interestingly, sometimes we think, well, there are forces that emerge, say, when market forces come up to take some genetic technology and run with it. We're wondering, well, who is really in control? Who's acting here? So very fascinating constellations of degrees of power, different ways of sort of influencing developments, etc.
All right, fascinating. I know we talked earlier, and as I read through your book, I recognize that the questions that come up here broadly theologically fall into that question of theodicy. We usually think of that in terms of suffering and how that works in the creation and its order. So, with that in mind, I know you deal with disabilities and you talk of that explicitly. In our first question, we're going to move to questions from the audience now. And Del Kuhn has submitted a question actually onto the forum. So, Del, if you could unmute and go ahead and ask that brief question. The authors have read your full context, but just set that up for them, okay?
Okay, thanks, John, and thanks for your book. I very much appreciate the focus you took ethically on people with disabilities. But what I kind of wonder going forward on this, whether you have any insights as to, now that we have the better tools for both detection and correction with CRISPR, whether we're going to be resurrecting the eugenics movement of a century ago, maybe giving it a more marketable, more palatable name. And if we are going to do that, whether CRISPR's, or basically the in vitro fertilization's cost, is going to shift any eugenics into the abortion space, essentially making abortion a, quote, poor man's CRISPR. And I'm kind of skeptical about whether the legal system is going to have much effect on it, because what might be illegal, quote, here is going to be medical tourism, quote, there. So I wonder whether you see our abilities that CRISPR has brought to the fore really affecting not so much embryonic gene editing, but a higher demand for abortion, say, following the Denmark and Iceland model about Down syndrome. So any insights? And again, thank you for the book, and thank you for the focus on people and not genes.
Keith, you want to start with
Maybe
this?
I could start off on that, and I think you raise a very good question. And to start, it's the question of what is a disability. There are some things that I think we would all agree on that are massive disabilities. Those children that are born or that maybe die as soon as they're born, that have tragic genetic inherited diseases. I think we'd all agree those are clear disabilities. But there are plenty of other things that there is a border. Is it what is a disability and what is not? I'm not a particularly good athlete. I have the wrong sort of genes for that. That just means I'm a different sort of a person. It doesn't mean that I'm disabled because I can't sprint like an Olympic champion. And there are then borders, things in the middle where we want to maybe discuss as to, so what is a disability, and are we trying to then to make perfect people, or to make people who actually are made in my image, that just look like me and have the same abilities that I have. That maybe that start our conversation. I'll throw it to Alex as well, another who wants to come back. But that for me is a starter. What is a disability?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Del Kuhn. So interestingly, one of the you're focusing more on one aspect, which is that with the new technologies, we would also gain more knowledge, and we're particularly interested in certain conditions, even if we may not use CRISPR that much. I think that's a very interesting angle to get at this. I am wondering, however, how common will it become for people either to do germline modification to modify human embryos, or perhaps out of an interest in these characteristics that everybody who knows may become interested in, physical fitness, etc., may then resort to abortion because perhaps it's less costly, or it's people may be more familiar with it. Well, I think, and the scientists in the room may need to check me on that, but so what could it look like? There may be a couple where somebody has a genetic predisposition for a certain disease, for example, and then a couple wonders, well, will our baby have this gene as well, or will it have a certain disability? So to actually resort to abortion, you would have to know what that baby's genes would look like. And there, of course, we're thinking of Down syndrome, where you can, there are, of course, optical procedures to arrive at the suggestion that a child may have Down syndrome, or you may eventually then analyze the genome with a tissue sample. But at the moment, it seems to me that I would doubt that taking such tissue samples would become mainstream. Or well, at the moment, the more recent thing would be NIPT, where a blood sample from the mother might be able to tell us does the child have Down syndrome. But something like that, for it to become more common, would really have to you would be looking at a condition that is as common or roughly as common as Down syndrome, and lots of these other genetic conditions would, I guess, be much rarer. So one might think of Huntington's disease or Duchenne or muscular dystrophy or those kinds of conditions. And then, of course, many people are worried about uses of abortion, but then a lot of planning and forethought would be required if a couple arrives at the question, does our baby have that condition? So maybe that would be more forethought and planning than a lot of people really put into the question. So it seems to me that for technical reasons, presumably, the scenario of abortion as genome editing for the poor doesn't seem to me like a scenario that is very prominent on my screen.
Maybe I can come in because I think abortion is a really important issue, but I'm not sure how relevant that is actually to the CRISPR-Cas, because it's not something that's inherited in Down syndrome. And we're talking really about correcting genetic diseases at an early stage before implantation is where this happens. All right, it could be a detection method that says that your baby is going to be deformed in some way, and then that leaves open the possibility of choosing abortion. But I think that's further down the line than what we're thinking about with CRISPR-Cas, which is it does the early embryo, maybe pre-implantation. Does that carry the particular gene? And should we therefore consider the possibility of correcting that defective gene? That's, I think, at the simplest level.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may
go ahead.
So if we're thinking about germline modifications, it's of course easy to, first of all, to listen to various thinkers who come up with lots of ideas about what parents might do to their baby to, as they see it, improve their baby's prospects. And so one could then easily fall for this spell of massive human interventions.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it always requires, if somebody were to be seriously pursuing germline modification, it does require a lot of planning, of course. So a couple would have to say, well, we're not going to have a baby by regular intercourse, but we would need to go find a lab, do IVF, etc. And undergoing IVF is also not the simplest of procedures, even quite apart from the cost. It's burdensome, at least for the mother. So I think those practical things are often good to keep in mind before one gets carried away by hypothetical scenarios that are deeply troubling.
Mm-hmm. And I think the technology is always going to be very expensive. So this is something that's going to be benefiting the rich only.
Yeah.
It's never, well, I may be wrong, but I don't think it's going to be something that's going to be widely used across the board. But for those who, with large sums of money, who can afford to invest in this sort of thing. So I get maybe that gives a greater, if you like, divergence in the human population between the rich who become gene rich and the poor who are the gene poor.
So I'm going to ask now if people would use under the reactions function, use the raised hand. So if you want to have follow-up questions, I'm tempted to jump in here and go back and forth myself, but I'd rather have the rest of the audience. And Dale, did you have one follow-up on that?
Yeah, just very, very briefly, I'm kind of encouraged by that, but I'll also go back to my concern if a condition is a one gene thing that can be modified in a child and adult after it's born, it just seems to me that that would be an equally easy thing to screen for with prenatal screening. But I agree on the cost is going to be prohibitive to do something, but testing before something is implanted is also going to be costly with an IVF cost. I wish I felt better about the whole thing, but I don't.
But I think that it certainly is an indication. I think many of us, all of us perhaps, are very uncomfortable with the territory we are in. This is new territory, and it reminds me a bit of growing up in the nuclear age, and suddenly you have atomic bombs and atomic energy, and the physical destruction of the planet is possible. And you go, wait a minute, are we ready for this? It feels like that in a different way. But so thank you for that. Let me turn to Brian Greuel. Brian, you have a question you want to raise then?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to echo Del Kuhn's praise of your emphasis on disability in this book. But I hope you also saw my overall high opinion of your book in the review that I did for the PSCF journal. My question relates to in vivo genome editing, which, just for the sake of those here, is a technology where the editing tools and delivery system is injected into patients. And this technology is clearly showing promise as a potentially less expensive way to accomplish therapeutic somatic gene editing, compared at least to ex vivo approaches that involve removing cells from the body, genetically modifying them, and putting them back into the body. And the advantage of in vivo gene editing may also be that it could allow treatment of a broader range of conditions where the cells and tissues that are affected in a particular disorder can't be easily removed from the patient and reintroduced following genetic modification. Mm-hmm. From these two standpoints, then it seems like the refinement of in vivo genome editing and making it more widely available seems like it would be the best way to proceed. What do you say then to the person who might be concerned about the remote possibility that these gene edits could also occur in the germline of these individuals, since the tools and for making the modifications are being injected into the individuals, and if these do make alterations in the germline, they could then potentially be transmitted to future generations. So I'm wondering what you think about this, especially given your general opposition to germline gene editing in your book.
Thank you. Can I pick up a few things on that? It is that I think that what we might call somatic cell modification, so in vivo, has far fewer risks to it than germline and embryo modification. It also gets around the question of autonomy because the patient has power over the technology, the power to choose or not, whereas embryos, of course, don't have that. I'm less worried with what you called in vivo modification. It's being used very powerfully on a few genetically inherited diseases, things like thalassemia, sickle cell disease. Those are examples. where it has been used. The CAR T technology has been used particularly for treating a number of cancers, where blood cells are taken out of the patient, modified in some very clever way, and then put back again, and you get very clear remissions from various tumors. Usually, to be honest, only cancers of where you can remove the whole of the original tissue. So they're usually blood cancers rather than other ones. There is a very small risk that if it's done by injecting the CRISPR-Cas technology into the patient, that could migrate to the germ cell and modify the germ cell. I don't know the numbers on that, but I think that the probability is very low. So that really doesn't worry me too much in terms of the risk that could be. But I granted it's there. I think we have to acknowledge that human reproduction is a risky business anyway. Even done by natural means, the number of pregnancies that fail, the number of children that are stillborn, those that have spontaneous mutations that you couldn't predict. Reproduction always has been and always will be a risky business. And this, if you like, is, I think, an added very, very small risk if we're talking about somatic cell modification. But I appreciate your question.
Thank you for that. Alex, do you have a quick response?
Well, just very briefly, I can't really speak on certain likelihoods and risks. You've also, I think, we've been steering in the direction of is the risk worth it? That's probably a good question. Sometimes people also ask, is it safe? And then, of course, the point to remember is that lots of the medical interventions that we do aren't entirely safe. There should be a risk and chances deliberation involved that balances both aspects. And there's probably hardly any entirely safe medical procedure. But nevertheless, I guess a discussion should take place about what sorts of risks there are, and that germline modification could be one of the unintended consequences. But I wouldn't say the risk must be zero before we engage in vivo modification.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. You know, this conversation reminds me of several things. As you said, Alex, medical procedures are not without risk. I'm thinking back to, you drop back 2,000 years ago, and people are performing all kinds of interesting medical procedures, and yet there's risk, and then there's risk of not doing something, right? And we haven't escaped that. That's a central part of our human condition. So a couple of things that come to mind I want to ask you about. We talked about disability, and Keith, you mentioned agency. So in terms of treatment, so if it's a patient that's being injected with a particular treatment, they can have agency. But I'm also thinking you keep talking about germline and somatic, and whether it's a therapeutic or not. And I wonder about that distinction. I'm thinking about, it was a couple of years ago, we had a forum, Cambridge Roundtable with George Church, and he was saying that distinction is probably not, it's more rhetorical than real. Because the somatic and the germline are always in interaction with one another, and constantly so. So I don't remember the details of his argument on that, but I'm guessing an example would be that if you make a modification of a person and they reproduce, you actually already you've where they wouldn't have otherwise, you've changed the genetic outcome into the future. So you're going to be sending these things forward no matter what we do, any technique. Does that Keith, you're nodding in some ways. What do you think about that?
And if somatic cell modification would only be for that individual and wouldn't carry forward into the next generation. Whereas obviously germline modification is permanent, that's fixed and carries on. So that's why I really don't have so much of a problem with this somatic. And you talk about agency. Let me be a little provocative, is that children don't have much agency anyway. It's the parents who choose, especially in their early life, that are responsible for the environment in which they're brought up, for the education that they have, the training in their language. Now, teaching them is something as simple as how to walk. It's parents have a lot of control already over their children. And this, if you like, is another level of in which the children wouldn't have any control. Now, that's not to say it's right, but it's maybe to say that the question isn't quite as simple as we first imagine.
Yeah, it never is, and it strikes me that one of the things that's happening here, you spend some time talking about what is a human, and what kinds of questions does this open up for us with this technology in terms of even if it's somatic modifications, your mind just spins away to all kinds of enhancements and alterations that might go on. And you wonder, you want to explore that a little bit? What were you thinking in terms of the definition of us as humans? What guidance might you have for the boundaries on that question?
Alex, do you want to come in with a theological answer, and I'll come and modify that if necessary?
Well, it's the age-old big question, of course. What is a human? So we've touched on the issue of agency and autonomy,
Right.
And I think very often the question is not so much which camp are you in? Are you pro-autonomy, or are you in the camp that is just down on this constant striving for maximum autonomy? But it's often a question of degrees. So yes, as a parent, I of course make important decisions about my child. But then again, my child has a chance to respond. Back in the 1970s, there was a debate already about human cloning, which was fairly theoretical, but there were some interesting insights there. There was this American ethicist, Cass, I'm forgetting his first name now, but who more as a thought experiment said, well, if we're cloning some genius on the piano, there's of course a reason why the parents are choosing that superstar on the concert stage. Will the child have the chance to respond? So yes, parents are making choices for their children, but if I send my parents to piano lessons, at some point I'll be asked, am I going to be a tyrant, or am I going to respect my child as a person? If they just say, no, piano is not for me. But at some point, perhaps we're making interventions where even the child may not be able to respond anymore. So you don't need to maximize the child's autonomy. I think that would be unrealistic. But you would look for a certain degree of autonomy. I think that is one thing that is typically human. Then, of course, there are dangers to autonomy that we tend to be opposed to. People who are very vulnerable due to homelessness and drug addiction, etc., have severely compromised autonomy. So that is where most of us would really like to join or cast a vote in favor of strengthening individual autonomy. But vulnerability is also at the core of living a fulfilled human life. And I mean, no friendship on the basis of trust would be possible if I were fully autonomous. I'm giving people power over me when I trust them. So autonomy is a big issue, of course, in terms of what it means to be human, and that comes into those biotechnological questions. We've touched on the question of disabilities, and Keith has brought up the question, what norm is there? We don't want to end up just with cookie cutter people. There, I think it's interesting maybe to look more deeply into disabilities, and probably maybe I could exaggerate a little and say no disability is the same as the next. So there are disabilities that we find very distressing to think about. There are disabilities that create tremendous obstacles for people, but with those obstacles, sometimes people do have the chance to grow and rise to a challenge. So that can be very impressive. Also thinking about how resourceful humans can be. And the terms, and maybe one last point to bring this to a close. One interesting constellation that I sometimes think about when the topic of disabilities comes up. The Apostle Paul writes about strength and weakness in the second letter to the Corinthians. He sort of lets on that somehow he has some kind of a disability as well. We're not entirely sure what the Apostle Paul had in mind there. But there may be instances where having a certain disability may not simply be weakness, but may also come with other strengths. So I'm thinking of a theologian who often publishes in the area of disabilities and theology, who has a son with multiple disabilities. And this his son, I'm thinking of Brian Brock, and his son never seemed to appreciate when the father brought home a gift, a little toy or something from his travels. And the father was very disappointed and had to struggle with that. But he found out that the son is much more interested in just spending personal time with him. And that could be something that people easily overlooked. And this father said, yes, he did overlook that. And that is a strength. So, I mean, it's just one example that's not particularly spectacular, but it's a perspective that's worth thinking about.
That's an important point, Alex. Keith, you want to follow up there?
Yeah, maybe to come back to this question of what is a human, really. And I mean, the Christian answer, the simple one is made in the image of God, and then we need to unpack just exactly what that means.
Right.
But it is clear that means that we're all, because it's an image of God isn't just imputed to powerful people, it's to all humans, irrespective of our physical or mental or whatever ability, is that we are known and loved by God irrespective of that and have equal value. So the disabled person might, humanly speaking, be less valuable to society and actually be a drain on society's resources. But in God's eyes, they're just as valuable, and we therefore should treat them as they're just as valuable and precious. And the image of God, if we say that means that some of the characteristics of God are imputed to us in terms of relationship, as in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, relating together, in terms of creativity. God creates. If we're made in his image, we expect that we should have some creative powers as well. Now, we should then use that responsibly, and that's where the debate comes into it. As we reflect on and mirror God's character in our lives and the things that we do. And that's, as Christians, what we want to do. Sometimes finding the boundaries on that are not so easy. In terms of, say, Alex helpfully pointed out that, you know, what's a strength to some people, or sorry, a weakness to some people is a strength to others. There was a debate a few years ago in the UK of a couple who were genetically deaf and asked, could they select an embryo who would always also be genetically deaf? Because to them, deafness wasn't a disability, it was a lifestyle. They communicated by sign language. I'd be interested to know what the courts now might say to that. In those days, the court said no, it was not legal to select for somebody who would have a disability. But they viewed that not as a disability, as I say, but as a lifestyle.
Well, this gets to the point, and thank you for both those responses. You're converging on a key question here: is who is the voice at the table? And when we talk, especially when we talk about a disability, and I'm thinking theologically, are there any of us that don't have a disability? And what is it? It's a definitional question. I mean, profoundly, it seems to me the scripture says humanity has a disability. It has a profound failure in it, and it can't be fixed by a CRISPR technology. It cannot be. You cannot repair that. There's only one method of repair for what ails you, and so that it seems to me that the table, the biblical table, is a very open one that wants everyone, and so it seems like we really need some humility when we come to these tools that we have, and okay, we're going to fix this thing. And so many people, the deaf community is one, folks in the autism community, folks in the Down syndrome community, you can name others, are now saying, I don't need to be fixed. I don't need your fixing. And it seems like what you're dealing with here opens up a whole suite of very powerful questions that cross all kinds of lines in our society, not just the simple thing of the technique of, can you do this in vivo, in vitro, can you, and the technology is just for like single genes at the moment, right? And many of these things that we're talking about, there's 600, 800, 1,000 of these single gene things that might be amenable quickly. But many of these things we're talking about are multigenetic, and they're epistatic in their nature of development. So maybe you want to say some more further about that.
Yes, I mean, many of these conditions, the complex conditions, are the result of interaction between many genes, and you're quite right, it may be 100 or more. The technology, at least in experimental cells, can be applied to many genes at the same time. So that may in itself not be a limitation. I've lost my train of thought for a minute, but I'll come back. I've temporarily lost the train of thought.
I know the feeling. It comes with a certain age. So, but we do
It
have
certainly does.
We do have a raised hand. Joseph, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Thank you. Once these technologies become reliable, safe, and moderately expensive, what do you think of the possibility of governments mandating them?
Good question. Good question.
That's always a possibility, but I'm not sure it will happen. I mean, C.S. Lewis did talk about man's power over nature becomes the ability of one man to have power over another one, writing in actually the 1940s, well before we knew any of this gene technology. I don't think it will be mandated in terms of correcting genes. I have remembered the point I was going to make before. It's that let's take a very extreme view. I think we'd all agree that we all have a problem with sin. And is it possible to correct that? Could we edit people to make them more virtuous? We know that some of our responses, some of the ways that we behave are the result of neurotransmitters. Can we modify the way in which those neurotransmitters work so as to make us more peaceable, shall we say? And I hope we'd all say that actually I want to, that God requires us to choose to be good, to choose to obey, and not to be automatons who are genetically programmed to be well-behaved, moral people who are very peaceable and get on with everybody else. Now, in theory, it's a very sort of dystopian and maybe a science fiction. In theory, we could modify some of the neurotransmitters that maybe make us less aggressive. But we shouldn't do that.
Alex, did you have a response there?
Maybe I'll just add another thought on the eugenics question. So a government mandating certain genetic changes. So that, of course, raises the specter of Nazi methods. And I think it's, well, just the other day, I listened to the podcast, The Rest is History, here from the UK, on life in Nazi Germany. What we often underestimate, looking back in history, is the extent to which people made themselves at home in that Nazi regime and thought this is the basis upon which we're operating now. So they went along with a lot of it. It wasn't just the government forcing rules on people, or perhaps sometimes they started forcing small changes, and then eventually people became more accustomed to that. So it would probably be, we really have to ask more than just that question. Might the government turn tyrannical and force us to do things that we may not want? But eugenics can be more subtle if there is a climate in society that in which we would like certain things, where there are ideals. So already in the 19th century, in the 1920s in Germany, there used to be a broad discussion on, as they called it, useless eaters, people who supposedly drain the resources of society. And there was one historian gave the example of a person who was the leader of a home for people with disabilities, and he wanted to enter into a dialogue because he was worried about those trends in society. So he sent a letter to the parents of the children and youths with disabilities of whom he was in charge. And he said, no worries, first of all, your children are in safe hands. Nobody's going to harm them. I'm just interested, if one could get rid of these children, what do people think? And then he was entirely shocked that so many people said, well, actually, yes, we would like to get rid of people. So even before the Nazis came to power. So it is discussions like these. What are disabilities simply defects that one would want to minimize, or do they perhaps indicate something deeper about us and about the value of our lives? So there may be a eugenicist within each of us.
I think also that there's the risk, rather than governments, which is what you said, of actually parents in competition with each other, pushy parents. Everybody wants what's best for their own child. It's very natural. And if these technologies are available, you'll want your child to have the best possible future. And so the danger, and I think other philosophers have said so, is not from governments. It's not from technology companies. It's actually from the parents themselves who wish the best for their children and fear for the worst.
Well, that actually goes right back to what I was saying about what is a human. I think this is endemic in us as humans. So we have these dilemmas we face. Joseph, do you have a follow-up question or response?
I'm speaking from the perspective of, I have a grandchild who was diagnosed with leukemia at age 2, and her parents' hands were essentially tied. Government would intervene if they did not sign up for what's regarded as acceptable medical treatment. Sometimes there's conflict of faith healing versus medical healing. But given if genetic modification can prevent really debilitating metabolic diseases, then would a government require you to avail yourself of it?
That's very good. Thanks for that, Joseph. I have a grandson too who has a disability. It's a different one. And so I know in our family we have these conversations all the time about what's covered and what's not, what's covered in education and what's not. And it's this tension between a society, how much capacity does a society have, and how much should that be delivered to what individuals? So there's a suite of questions. I know you, gentlemen, in the book, you try and deal with some of that issues. I think there's much more in the conversation there that needs to go on. We're approaching our hourly mark here. If there's anyone that wants to raise a hand or a question, I think we could take one more question, and if not, Keith's going to raise his hand, so please.
It's not a question, it's more a comment on what you said about those people who have disabled children one way or another. I hesitate sometimes to speak on the air at this topic because I have 3 very healthy children and 4 very healthy grandchildren, and these things become very, very personal. And it's all very well talking about suffering in the abstract, but when it actually impacts the individual, we almost need to take a case-by-case decision on each one of these, because sometimes they're tragic. It involve all sorts of emotional and familial interactions, which those of us who stand remote for it have a right to contribute, but we don't quite have the same degree of personal interaction with it, and therefore I'm cautious.
Maybe I'll just add, this touches on the question that Brian Greuel mentioned in his review of the book. Why are we fine with PGD selecting embryos, and why are we then against germline modification? So if I may just try to start to address that issue, so that is precisely as Keith said. There may be parents who can't find it in themselves to deal with a very debilitating condition. And from a Christian point of view, I also think that there is a certain tension in New Testament texts that helps us think about those issues and explore them, to come at this question from different angles, because there is the tradition of healing and also of reintegration into society that you'd often find in those healing traditions with Jesus at the center. And then there is the tradition with Paul, who says a weakness, or if we want to take it as a disability, it's not just a defect, but it's also a state with its own dignity and integrity. So I would find it difficult to pursue just one perspective, embrace disability, and discourage all medical attempts to minimize vulnerability. It's again a question of degree, in the similar sense as I've tried to sketch it out with autonomy. To some extent, you do want to encourage and enable autonomy, but you don't simply want to maximize it. It's a little bit, you may need to differentiate and see what the particular situation is like.
Thank you for that. I think this is a very interesting place maybe to draw this together. I'm reminded in this conversation, you're talking about humility, You're talking about a stance, a way that we should be looking at one another and treating one another. And this, as this conversation today and your book demonstrates, this involves not just interpersonal niceness. It's not just being polite and collegial with one another. It's not even just sort of obeying the laws as believers in Christ. We're called to this, a standard. We're called to a place. I want to let you know that the ASA fellows are in a conversation now about a code of practice for the ASA, a member code of practice, which involves some of the things we've been talking about. One of the features there is humility in our scholarship, and in our conversation, being curious and open to other people and inviting conversation. And I think those values that we're talking about in that code of practice inform these kinds of really challenging technological questions. We have tools and power that sometimes it feels a bit beyond us, and we really need humility in our approach. The ASA will be putting that code of practice out after the fellows conversation, and the board has further conversations on it. It will be coming to the entire membership this summer at the annual meeting. So if you're a fellow, I would urge you to think about the conversation we've had today in light of our code of practice. These are the kinds of issues that we need to take on and to continue to discuss. Alex, Keith, we really appreciate you coming and being with us today. And Brian, thank you for your good review of the book. It's always nice to have a reviewer together with the authors and have them in a friendly conversation and complimenting one another. And for all of you listening today, thank you so much. We welcome you to come back next month for our next Diving Deeper discussion. Have a good afternoon.